There's a new indie darling game making waves right now, and its name is Mixtape. Looking like the love child of Life is Strange, Superbad, and heck, even the Spider-Verse films from Sony. It's been on quite the ride, not just for its divisive experience and polarizing general opinion, but for its cost to length and even the harm it could have when it's actually being used for streamer content. While it's not much of a debate that for all intents and purposes it's still counted as a game in the same vein as a Telltale Games narrative, the question looming on everybody's head is if it deserves the hate it has, or whether or not you could even count it as an indie. So what exactly is Mixtape anyway? At first glance, the game almost feels like somebody took over a teenager's memory box and turned it into something playable. Developed by Beethoven and Dinosaur and published by Annapurna Interactive, Mixtape released for PC, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and Nintendo Switch 2 with a very specific goal in mind: making players feel something rather than challenge them mechanically. The game follows three friends during one final night together before adulthood inevitably tears them apart. And unlike most modern games trying to hook players with giant open worlds, endless side quests, battle passes, or skill trees, Mixtape instead focuses entirely on atmosphere, memories, music, and emotional storytelling. One moment you're skateboarding down a hill under neon lights, the next you're exploring abandoned places, taking photos, or simply vibing out while licensed tracks completely take over the scene. And honestly, that's where a lot of people either completely fall in love with the game or immediately bounce off it. Because the thing about Mixtape is that it almost feels less like a traditional game and more like an interactive coming-of-age film where the player occasionally takes the wheel. And that soundtrack absolutely carries a huge part of the experience too. The game features tracks from artists and bands like Joy Division, The Smashing Pumpkins, Iggy Pop, and Shosi and the Banshees, which instantly gives the game this nostalgic emotional pull even before the story fully kicks in. But of course, the moment people found out about the runtime and pricing, the discourse exploded online. Mixtape launched at around $19.99 US dollars, or around 625 Philippine pesos. For some players, that was perfectly reasonable considering the production quality, soundtrack licensing, and presentation. But for others, paying almost 1,000 pesos for a game many people finished in around 4 to 5 hours felt like way too much. When you compare it to watching a movie though, you're making your money's worth if you're just talking about the length. And that's where the conversation regarding Mixtape became far bigger than just the game itself. Because despite the backlash, the game is actually reviewing extremely well. Critics have praised its visual direction, emotional storytelling, soundtrack usage, and cinematic presentation. Steam reviews also leaned heavily positive shortly after launch, which only made the divide even more noticeable. And honestly, Mixtape kind of arrived at the perfect, or maybe worst possible time for this type of discussion. Modern gamers are constantly comparing value now. Every game gets measured against giant open-world RPGs, live service titles, and multiplayer games capable of eating up hundreds of hours of somebody's life. So when a narrative-focused experience comes out with a shorter runtime, people immediately start asking whether emotional impact alone is enough to justify the asking price. And Mixtape sits directly in the center of that debate. Because depending on who you ask, this game is either a beautifully crafted interactive story about youth and nostalgia, or a glorified movie pretending to be a video game. Now personally, I think this argument says more about the current state of gaming than it does about Mixtape itself. We've gotten so used to games being measured through content volume that shorter narrative experiences immediately get treated like lesser products. But not every game is trying to be the next forever game that dominates your life for 6 months straight. Some games just want to tell a story, leave an emotional mark, and end. The bigger issue though is that Mixtape also runs into another very modern problem: streamer culture. Normally, viewers would be fine with a backseat rider experience, letting streamers take the wheel. But in the case of Mixtape, it's these little hindrances that prevent it from actually being streamable. Think about it, the soundtrack is great at telling its story, but Twitch and other social media platforms think otherwise. More than a couple of seconds and their content's demonetized, and you can't censor it fully because the music is part of the experience, like with the Guardians of Galaxy films. You'd also think that they'd have content creators in mind as an indie, but there's a certain demographic targeted by this and it shows. Now here comes the funniest part of the whole discourse. Is Mixtape even actually an indie game? Technically speaking, yes. It was developed by Beethoven and Dinosaur, which is still considered a relatively small studio compared to the gigantic AAA developers. But at the same time, calling something backed by Annapurna Interactive a small indie project feels a little weird now, doesn't it? Because Annapurna has basically built a reputation for publishing highly artistic, cinematic, and emotional driven games with extreme polished presentation. The second people see their logo attached to a project, expectations immediately skyrocket. And honestly, this is where the definition of indie has become kind of blurry in modern gaming. Back then, indie games used to mean tiny, low-budget passion projects made by a handful of developers working out of garages or bedrooms. But now, some indie games have better art direction, music, and storytelling than massive AAA releases with budgets in the hundreds of millions. So while Mixtape is structurally indie, it doesn't necessarily feel indie in the traditional sense anymore. The divide is getting closer and closer between what constitutes an indie game and a AAA game, but really there's an argument for whichever side of the fence you're on. Depending on who you ask, Mixtape could be a game or really just a movie, but personally speaking, preferences will always prevail and it feels more like a hands-on experience rather than a mechanical marvel, and that's alright. Games like this had existed for quite some time, and while ratings would differ depending on who you ask, there's just the semblance of bias towards how anybody would feel. That aside, let's pretend your favorite franchise has a story-based narrative game. Would you be as strict with it as you are with Mixtape? Why or why not? Let us know in the comments below. For more content like this and other updates down the line, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.